Today we're going to talk about one of the most important policy papers to come out in recent years, a paper from the McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security at Auburn University, done in partnership with Cyber Florida at the University of South Florida. This paper was authored by an absolutely stellar task force. We're talking about Chris Inglis, who served as the first U.S. National Cyber Director. We've got Thomas Bossert, who was Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. And I should mention Tom is also the president and co-founder of Trinity Cyber, which is a Gula Tech Adventures portfolio company. Frank Cilluffo, who directs the McCrary Institute, and General Kenneth McKenzie, who's retired from the Marine Corps and now leads the Global and National Security Institute. This wasn't just academics writing theory. This was practitioners who've been in the room when these decisions get made. So let me start with the central question that drives this entire paper. Why does cyber policy feel reactive while our adversaries act proactively? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Cyberspace is no longer episodic. It's not about waiting for the next big attack and then responding. Competition is happening continuously right now below the threshold of armed conflict. Our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they're operating in peacetime, pre-positioning access, setting up for future operations. And here's the problem. Our legal frameworks, our organizational structures, our policy mechanisms, they were all designed for a different era. They were built for episodic conflict, for clear distinctions between peace and war. The McCrary Institute puts it bluntly, U.S. cyber policy is misaligned with the reality of persistent competition. Let me walk you through how we got here. Before 2010, cyber operations were almost entirely intelligence-driven. We're talking about Title 50 authorities, espionage, collection, maintaining long-term access. The emphasis was on secrecy, on not getting caught, on preserving those accesses for as long as possible. Then from 2010 to 2017, we started seeing this transition. The military was getting more involved, but there was this persistent ambiguity, like who owns what mission? Is this an intelligence operation or a military operation? And the approval processes were painfully slow. The real shift came in 2018 with National Security Presidential Memorandum 13, NSPM 13. This replaced the old Presidential Policy Directive 20, and it delegated significantly more authority to the Department of Defense. It enabled U.S. Cyber Command to conduct foreign cyber operations without having to go back to the White House for every single action. This is when we formally adopted the concepts of persistent engagement and defend forward. Now let's talk about offensive cyber operations, because this is where people get nervous. The McCrary Institute makes a critical point. Offensive cyber operations are not about escalation or destruction. They're about denying adversaries uncontested access. They're about disrupting their planning, imposing uncertainty and friction on their operations. Offense, when done right, is actually stabilizing. It's a way to restore balance. It's not a replacement for defense. It's a complement to it. Think about it this way. If your adversary can operate freely in your networks, if they can pre-position malware in your critical infrastructure without any consequences, what message does that send? It tells them they have free rein. Offensive operations are about imposing costs continuously, not waiting until after you've been attacked, which brings us to deterrence. Classic deterrence models, the kind that worked during the Cold War, they struggle in cyberspace. Why? Because attribution takes time, because effects are often reversible, because adversaries can maintain plausible deniability, because so many operations happen below the threshold of armed conflict. The report argues for something called deterrence by denial. You don't just threaten punishment after the fact. You actively contest their access, you persistently engage them, you make it harder for them to operate. Deterrence in cyberspace is achieved through sustained engagement, through preemptive disruption, through strategic signaling done with actions, not just statements. Now let's talk about our adversaries, because understanding their approach is critical. China demonstrates the clearest long-term cyber strategy of any nation. They're not just conducting espionage, they're integrating cyber into their entire national strategy. Russia uses cyber for coercion, for disruption, for influence operations. Iran and North Korea leverage cyber for asymmetric advantage, and it's a way for them to punch above their weight. What they all have in common is this: they pre-position access in critical infrastructure during peacetime. They combine espionage with influence operations with disruption capabilities, though they don't separate these things into neat little boxes the way we do. And here's the hard truth that the McCrary Institute emphasizes. We cannot defend our way out of this competition. Defense alone is insufficient. This brings us to one of the thorniest issues in the entire paper, the legal and authority challenges. We have this unresolved tension between Title 10 and Title 50. Title 10 governs military operations, Title 50 governs intelligence activities, and cyber operations, they blur these distinctions constantly. Intelligence agencies want to maintain long-term access. They want to watch and collect. Military planners want operational effects. They want to disrupt and deny. These are fundamentally different priorities, and our oversight mechanisms were designed for a slower world. They can't keep pace with cyber timelines. The authorities we're working with were designed for episodic conflict. You declare war, you fight, you make peace, but cyberspace doesn't work that way. It's continuous competition. The report calls for clearer authorities, updated legal frameworks, and policy alignment with operational reality. And frankly, this is overdue. Now, there's a fascinating debate in this paper about organizational structure. The question is, should the United States create a standalone cyber force? The arguments in favor are compelling. Cyberspace is a foundational war-fighting domain now. It requires dedicated career pipelines. You need acquisition processes and doctrine that are aligned to cyber timelines, not to the way we buy ships or aircraft. But the arguments against are also strong. There's a risk of fragmentation. You could lose the tight integration between intelligence and military operations. That's actually been one of our advantages. And there's a question of whether it's premature. Are we creating a new bureaucracy before we've really thought through what it needs to be? The McCrary Institute doesn't mandate a conclusion here, but they stress something important. The risk is not in making the wrong decision about organizational structure. The risk is in unmanaged drift. The risk is in letting this happen by accident rather than by design. So what are the strategic implications of all this? For government, the message is stark. Policy alignment is strategic power. Every day of delay equals strategic disadvantage. Credibility depends on action, not just statements. For the private sector, and this is something I talk about a lot with our portfolio companies, cyber competition spills directly into enterprise networks. When you're looking at managed detection and response platforms, when you're evaluating security tools, you're seeing the reflection of state-level realities. Defense alone is insufficient for you too. The McCrary Institute's core findings are these. U.S. cyber dominance depends on policy alignment, not just technical capability. Incrementalism is a strategic choice, and it has consequences. Deterrence requires action, not just signaling. Offensive cyber must be disciplined and governed, not unchecked, but not absent either. And legal and organizational reform is unavoidable. Here's their conclusion. Cyberspace is now a primary domain of strategic competition. If we fail to modernize our authorities, our doctrine, our organizational structures, we will lose initiative, we will reduce our deterrence capability, and we will find ourselves at strategic disadvantage. The decisions we make now will shape crisis stability, alliance credibility, and long-term U.S. cyber advantage. And here's what I think is the most important takeaway from this entire paper. This is not an argument for reckless cyber offense. What the McCrary Institute is arguing for is strategic clarity, policy modernization, credible, disciplined cyber power. Because here's the thing, in cyberspace, inaction is itself a strategic decision. When you choose not to act, when you choose not to contest adversary access, when you choose not to impose costs, you are making a choice. You're choosing to cede the initiative. And that brings me to the final question that this paper poses, and it's one I want you to think about. If cyberspace is always contested, what does preparedness actually mean? Does it mean having the best defensive tools? Sure, that's part of it. Does it mean having skilled analysts and incident responders? Absolutely. But it also means having the authorities, the organizational structures, the legal frameworks, and the strategic clarity to operate in this domain the way our adversaries already do. This paper from Chris Inglis, Tom Bossert, again, president of Trinity Cyber, one of our portfolio companies, Frank Cilluffo, General McKenzie, and the entire McCrary Institute task force is one of the most important contributions to cyber policy discourse that we've seen in years. It's not telling us what we want to hear, it's telling us what we need to hear. The era of incremental cyber policy is over. The question is whether we recognize that before our adversaries exploit the gap even further. All right, I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this with me today. If you found this valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got tons of content on cybersecurity policy, on AI risks, on startup advice for founders, on threat intelligence, on everything from getting into cyber as a career to understanding the latest nation-state threats. Check out some of our other videos. We've got interviews with former NSA directors, CISOs, cybersecurity founders, policy experts. We've even got some fun animated content that breaks down complex cyber concepts in entertaining ways. And if there's a specific topic you want me to cover, drop it in the comments. I read them all, and I'm always looking for what the community wants to learn about. Thanks for watching, and remember, in cyberspace, preparedness is a verb, not a noun. Stay vigilant out there.